All right, thank you for joining us. My name is Ivette Bayo Urban. I'm a doctoral candidate at the Information School at the University of Washington. I just finished up my 6th year, and I'm here talking to two of my sheroes and heroes, and I'll let them introduce themselves.
How you doing? I'm Domonique Meeks. I am the co-owner of AmbassadorStories. We are a small digital and social media company that is highlighting stories about the amazing places that bring culture to our cities.
And I'm Virginia Eubanks, and I'm a writer and recovering academic and a economic justice and specifically welfare rights organizer and activist. And I've written some books that I think we're probably going to talk about a little bit today. Nice. So that's probably enough for now.
Thank you. Well, I first met Virginia back in 2014 at the National Women's Studies Association conference, and I was really inspired by the book that I read at that time, which was based on your dissertation, The Digital Dead End. And the reason that it inspired me was because I had not thought of how digital inclusion gets framed and who gets to count. And so reading that book, having met you and had the opportunity to have some conversations really has helped shape the direction that I've taken in my work, and really thinking about work with Latinas and how that translates to other socially defined identities and other things. So let's just jump on into your new book. So why don't you tell us about your new book?
So I just want to say thank you so much. That's actually really, really meaningful. I'm really excited anytime something that I work on is useful to people. And it's very much sort of part of I have a very practical ethics around activism and organizing and scholarship. And it's really about creating tools that I hope will be useful to people and trying to produce stuff in really transparent ways so that I'm accountable to my process, and also that other people can recreate the kinds of work I've done if they want to. And so it just means a lot to me to hear that. So I really appreciate it. So I want to say that first. And then if you want to hear about the new book, so I just turned in a manuscript for a book that will be published by St. Martin's Press in January. And the book is called Automating Inequality: How High-Tech Tools Profile police and punish the poor. The book is new, so I'm still getting my title down. And in that book, I tell 3 stories of new sort of high-tech tools that are being used mostly in public and human services. So the first is the story of an attempt to automate all of the eligibility processes for TANF, the welfare program, the Welfare Cash Assistance Program, food stamps, which are now called SNAP, or Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. We'll just call them SNAP, and Medicaid. And that took place in 2006 in Indiana. And the process was very bumpy and resulted in about 2.5 years and about 1 million benefits denials for poor and working class Hoosiers. And actually went sort of so off the rails that the governor at the time, was a man named Mitch Daniels, canceled the contract, which was with a coalition of high-tech companies, including IBM and ACS, canceled the contract with IBM. IBM sued for breach of contract after they had paid close to $500 million on the contract, and won. That they had not actually breached the contract. It has gone back and forth since, and I think the Superior Court, found that there was some breach. But it's a really fascinating story. So that's the first story. The second story is a story of a system called the Coordinated Entry System, which is a survey instrument called, the terrible name, the VI-SPDAT. Or the Vulnerability Index and Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool, which is supposed to risk rate all of the unhoused people in Los Angeles County in order to match them with what are the most appropriate available housing resources.
Mm.
So there's stakes on this are really, really high. There's close to 50,000 unhoused people in Los Angeles County, which is the entire population of the town that I live in. The entire town that I live in is homeless in Los Angeles. So this is a huge housing crisis there.
Mm-hmm.
So this system consists of the prioritization tool, a database that includes all the data, and then two algorithms, a ranking algorithm and a matching algorithm. They're supposed to match people to resources. And I'm not going to go into depth into any of this stuff. You can follow up, and we can talk more about what these things mean. But I'll just tell you the three stories first. And the third system is, and the coordinated entry system started, there was a pilot in 2013, so that's much more recent.
Mm-hmm.
And the third system that I talk about in the book is called the Allegheny Family Screening Tool. And it is a statistical model that is supposed to be able to predict which children in Allegheny County, which includes Pittsburgh, might be victims of abuse or neglect in the future. It's used by their child, youth, and families intake center, where the calls come in for child abuse and neglect hotline. And it risk rates families in order to give intake screeners additional information to make choices about whether or not to open investigation of those families for child abuse or neglect. So those are the three stories that I tell in the book.
Yeah. I just got the chills when you mentioned the third one, because I think it intersects with another identity, which is children, right? And
yeah.
Targeting, it just had an extra layer of creepiness, I guess, than the first two.
Right.
Anything that came for you?
Well, I think the thing that's important is that the stakes in all of these things are really high, right? So this is certainly not, I'm a skeptic about many of these tools, but I was not looking to write a hatchet job about these tools. I recognize how high the stakes are, right? Like how important it is that people who are entitled to public assistance programs get access to them. At the same time, how real it is that these municipalities and counties and states and cities are working with really limited budgets, and that's from a set of political choices that we've made as a culture.
Right.
And that the stakes are incredibly high. Like the state does have a right to step in and protect people who can't protect themselves, including children. And caretakers do sometimes, unfortunately, do horrible things to their children. And so there's a reason that these things exist. But why I wrote the book, part of why I wanted to research and write the book, is that there was really only one story being told about these systems. And the story was that they're largely administrative systems that mostly improve efficiency and sometimes transparency of government, and that they will produce better outcomes for everyone. And my experience as a welfare rights activist led me to believe that that might not always be true. And so all the stories that I heard, and some other people have written about these systems and have written about them in really capable ways, but what stood out to me is that no one had talked to the people who lost their benefits in Indiana, and no one had talked to unhoused people in LA who had experienced this survey and the system, and no one had talked to the parents of children who were being risk rated. And that seemed really like a very important gap to me, and that I could really learn something important from these people's stories. And I did. Yeah.
Well,
I think go ahead.
No, go on.
No, I think what stood out to me, first of all, what you were talking about in people's individual stories and how they tie into the system, but also thinking about technology and who's creating these systems and who's designing these systems. And if we're not doing it from a community structure where community has input of what's going on, then we're really at a loss, right? And so, yeah, it's scary to think about just the demographics behind the folks that are behind creating these systems, right? We know for the most part that our tech industry is not as diverse as it should be, whether we're talking about gender or ethnicity, and especially when we're talking about socioeconomic background, right? And so without those stories and that insight of, okay, what did the folks who were in Los Angeles who would be using this program, how were they able to have their input used during iteration of this tool?
Yeah.
And so that's
yeah, and it's actually really interesting. So again, I chose Indiana, maybe a little bit less so. Indiana's a pretty straightforward story,
right.
but LA and Pittsburgh are both really very complex, and especially in Pittsburgh, the Children, Youth, and Families, the Allegheny County Department of Children, Youth, and Families, let's just call it CYF. CYF actually had a very open and participatory process producing this tool. And so one of the things that's really interesting about that case is I can kind of push on that as the only solution we have, right? So a lot of the solutions that we read sort of in the literature right now, and they're, I'm saying, really important, really crucial insights, but they largely have to do with like transparency and participation.
Right.
And sort of to get to the, a question that you were going to ask, Ivette, about the sort of lessons being taken out of this. So I think the first one that's really important is that technology has a relationship to history, in that it builds on history and it shapes the future, right? But it doesn't just drop out of the sky and miraculously level out all of the power relationships in the way that sometimes we think about, especially new technologies. We think of them as levelers.
Right.
And so one of the things I do in the book is the first chapter, I give a very complete but short, because it's a popular book, history of poverty policy in the United States. So starting with the poorhouse, and then talking about scientific charity, and then talking about eugenics and the role of eugenics, public welfare, and also the welfare rights movement, which really pushed back specifically on some of the racial exclusions in public welfare. So I want people to understand these technologies as moments in history rather than as these brand new magical moments, right? I think the way we think about them tends to sort of veer into magical thinking that, you know, if we have this great new app or this more efficient system or this way of matching people, that, right, all of this history that came before won't matter. And the reality is the history of poverty policy in the United States is pretty appalling. Right? Like poorhouses were extrajudicial prisons for the poor. They were technically voluntary, so that's actually really important. But they were voluntary in the sense that homeless shelters are voluntary, right? And scientific charity very much was focused on investigating people's moral deservingness in a way that has stayed with us for a long time. It really is the grounding of the systems of public assistance we have today are not about, it would be great if they were about, like, how can we affirm your decisions and help expand your agency so you can make decisions that will get you to a better place. They're largely about sort of investigating whether or not the fact that you're poor is your fault.
Right.
And there's no reason to think that a new tool will necessarily do away with that. And so we see a lot of those threads from history come through in these new tools. So it really, when we start thinking about solutions, we really have to do some deep work, right? We need to do that design work, absolutely, but we also need to, you know, have a getting our souls right moment around how we think and talk about poverty in the United States. And then we also have to have a real political moment around the sort of punitive infrastructure that we have for the social welfare state, so that there's big things that need to happen. And until we do those big things, that, you know, the technology will reflect what our culture thinks about poverty and economic inequality, which is it's your fault and you know, suck it.
Well, there's two things that came up for me when you started saying the first lesson, and you said it doesn't just fall out of the sky. And what immediately came to me was the idea of Sky Woman, right? Like she was the only one who fell out of the sky, and then it was turtles all the way down. And so when I think of history, like really that's where I take it back to. Like if we don't start to think of the history of this country, right? Yeah. What it was founded on, whose bodies and whose land we're on, if we don't start there, all the other political systems, all the infrastructures, I mean, it's just a reflection of colonization, right? And so I think that's one of the things that I think of when I hear you talk, right? Where the same thing happened with boarding schools, right? The same thing happened. It was all your fault. You don't know any better. So we weren't able to see the innovation that was happening. We weren't able to see the technologies that the indigenous people were using because we were so focused on it had to look and be a certain way. And I think that digital tools are no different, right? Like they are another tool, and I think sometimes they can be the right tool, and I think they can be designed with good things in mind. But if we don't have that equity piece in place, then we're going to be losing something. And I think, being able to ground it in multiple perspectives of history, right, is important.
So this is going to be a bad paraphrase, but one of the things I talk about at the end of the book, and we'll get to this, is about the Poor People's Movement of 1967-68, the Poor People's Campaign. And one of the quotes that just keeps resonating for me is from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who says, human progress does not roll on the wheels of inevitability. Right. So the idea is like, if we want these tools to work for justice, we have to build them to work for justice. And it's not going to happen by accident. And that just seems like a very basic lesson that we continue to have to relearn pretty often.
Yeah.
Wow.
I coined this phrase of the digital poorhouse in this book. And kind of the origin story of this book is I learned many years ago now that one of the things that was part of the 1996 welfare reforms in the United States was a requirement that all states computerize their administrative processes around welfare. And that was in 1996. And I was really interested in fascinating. That must have been such a big change. And I wonder how it impacted both the work of caseworkers and the experience of clients. And I did some research around that. But I wasn't sure I understood the historical timeline. So I went to the New York State Archives and I started looking at the sort of design specs for all of these systems. There's a welfare management system and the Medicaid, MMIS, Medicaid Management Information System, maybe. There's a lot of these systems. And I was like, so these probably all started, in the 90s. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking in the 90s and I'm like, oh no, they already existed in the 90s. So I went back farther and I'm like, they were already there in 84. Even when Reagan, they were already there. So where did they actually get started? Mm-hmm. And it turns out that in the US, most of this sort of computerization, databaseizing of these systems happened in the early 70s. And right around 1973 is when you start seeing it happening. And that was a surprise to me. I was like, wow, that's really early. What else was going on that made it seem like it was really important to computerize the public assistance system? Because it doesn't seem like, of all the things you could do with the earliest computers, checking on people's income for welfare just doesn't seem like it would be the first thing on the list. And so what I learned is that what was happening at that time was this massive, powerful, very successful welfare rights movement that started in about 1963, was in many ways an offshoot of the civil rights movement. It was started mostly by Black poor women in Boston, LA, New York, but in many other places around the same time. That they were challenging explicitly the exclusion of people of color, but primarily African-American women from public services, Though it wasn't an interracial movement, and very explicitly, very strategically an interracial movement, Johnny Tillman, one of the sort of key players in this movement in the National Welfare Rights Organization, was very, very strategic and very conscious about finding poor white allies in a way that I think is really interesting. But they were really, really successful. They were not only successful in opening public services to African-American folks and people of color more generally, but they were also really successful in legal challenges to some of the really punitive rules that had in the past allowed caseworkers to say, enter your home between midnight and 4 a.m. and look in your fridge and under your beds to make sure there was no men hiding there, right? Or that made it illegal, basically, if you were getting public assistance to move across state lines, right? So there's all of these basic constitutional rights that were not being held, not being respected for people who were on public assistance. And that's one of the things that the welfare rights movement very much went after. And they had a string of legal successes in the late 60s and early 70s. And at that time, you see the public assistance roles expand. Not nearly as much as people think they did, right? Like in the United States, I think it's never been more than 40 or 50% of people below the poverty line have ever received public assistance. But it was like 20% before them, and it went up to almost 50, right? So they were really successful. And they also got it basically written into law that poor people deserve the same constitutional rights as everybody else. They have a right to due process when they're denied their benefits, like things like fair hearings. They have a right to move wherever they want. They have a right to freedom of movement. They have a right to some kind of privacy inside their own homes. They have a right to bodily integrity. Like all of these things were not actually legally protected rights before 1973. And so this is this huge, huge moment. If you look at New York, there were something between 60 and 80 organized welfare rights organizations in New York City by 1970. And they had started to really build with caseworkers, and caseworkers were starting to say to the state, like, if you don't make it easier for people to get public assistance, we're going to strike, right? So there's all of these like amazing alliances being built. And that's actually the moment that they build these databases. That's exactly when it happens. So what happens is there's a professional middle class, mostly white backlash against the expansion of welfare rights. Both in terms of financial, and I argue, in terms of this like very radical idea that poor people deserve the same rights as everyone else. So there's this very, very strong backlash that's happening. But on the other hand, these legal rights are now, established. So what can government, like local, municipal, and state government do? And what they decide to do to contain the growth and to turn back the successes of the welfare rights movement is they create systems that are intentionally built to look for fraud, to investigate people in ways that had been made illegal to do in person, right? But doing it through their data rather than through invading their homes. And the impact of that is almost immediate. So like 1973, public assistance receipt is as high as it has ever been in our history, and as equal in terms of race as it's ever been in our history. And just like 10 years later, it's half. And this is all by like 1984. This is way before welfare reform. And so there's this moment where I realized, like, it's so fascinating that this technical system basically accomplished everything that we rhetorically accomplished with the end of welfare in 1996, like at least a decade before that. It had done all the work that it came before the policy. And the policy was kind of a cherry on top, right? Like it was like a rhetorical insistence that it was okay to do this, but most of the change had already happened. So I think one of the really important lessons of this book for me is that we often use technology as a way to avoid big political conversations. Because what happened with the digital poorhouse is we were able to say, these aren't political decisions. We're not making political choices. These are just administrative efficiencies. right? This is more responsive, more transparent, more efficient governance, but we're not actually making political decisions. When in fact, all of these political decisions were built into those systems, including the most important thing to do if you're going to build a massive and fairly expensive technological infrastructure for welfare is to identify fraud, rather than say identify where people are not getting the benefits they have a right to. Right? That would be a very different kind of a system.
Yeah.
So this way that we sometimes use technology to avoid really important political conversations, I think is also a really important lesson in the book, and something that really changed the way I think about these systems. So that was a long story, but I think it's a really interesting one. I get in the weeds a little bit around the history. I'm fascinated by it.
No, I mean, I think that it's awesome.
Yeah.
The research that you've done to tie in something that I think that when I teach it or when I talk to folks about it that may or may not, you know, look or study or think about these systems, is that not all identities are valued equally in our society, right? So if we start from that premise, right, then looking that there are identities that are undervalued and then systemically policed that way, you know, whether, lots of socially defined identities that are undervalued. And if we start as that as our starting point, then we can see how it might trickle in the systems to do things that they're built for, right? It was intentionally built that way.
Excuse me. Yeah, I'm even with the first example, in this example, I'm thinking about the digital divide and the access to information, and who has the access to this information to even try to make the changes that are happening. And it's a completely different topic, but somewhat related. I think about in your comment that we often use technology to avoid the big political conversations. The city that I grew up in, Kent, maybe a few years back, decided that they were going to try to bring some equity by giving each student a laptop to take home, and not really thinking about, does every kid have Wi-Fi when they get home? Does every kid know how to use this laptop when they get home? What about the guidance that has to happen when we give a piece of technology, and where we are kind of putting this Band-Aid on root issues? These kids in different neighborhoods are still going to have books that are 3 generations behind the kids in different parts of the neighborhood, but they have this laptop, and so it's interesting. And so for the other side of it, it's like, hey, we did our job. We gave laptops to kids. You said they needed technology. Here it is.
Right.
In the name of, like you said, efficiency. Right. And so,
well, and piggybacking on that comment, I also think about, well, you gave the technology to the kid, but now you're creating a divide in the home because the kid has access to more technology, but you're not also sharing and communicating and talking about those vulnerabilities to the parents. So, then it can create additional divides in the home, because then there's the power dynamic. There is just an exacerbation of problems that are created because it's just a Band-Aid, instead of trying to see, well, do they even want this technology in their home, right? Does it collect my information as to where I'm going? Is the family that is receiving this, are they undocumented? How might that put them at risk? Have we talked about the metadata for images, and, do you put that online? And there's lots of different things that schools and counties and municipalities don't talk about when they are approaching it from a digital inclusion lens. And it's usually about access, but not about, let's talk about the different vulnerabilities and see what is it that they want? Because they may not want that device in the home, right?
I think access is hugely important, and I come out of the Community Technology Center movement in the 90s in the Bay Area, and it has always been a hugely central part of the work that I do, and I think it's hugely important. That said, I think that the assumption that poor and working people fundamentally lack things, including access to technology, is often empirically incorrect. My experience and my research has showed that poor and working people have different kinds of access to technology, including some things where they are very much the test population for technologies they would not try on the middle class. That it's not so much although, let me rephrase, it is access, but it is also when technology accesses you, right? It's not just about the object, it's also about these systems that we build that target, track, profile, and police people. So for example, I think one of the huge issues with the Allegheny family screening tool in Pittsburgh, there's huge issues about the way the system has been built and what it uses as outcome variables and predictive variables. There's a whole, you can get the book for that conversation. But I think one of the key insights of that is that is just a system that they could never get away with using on the professional middle class, right? Because in order to use it on the professional middle class, they would have to gather data not from public programs. They would have to gather data from private doctors and from babysitters and nannies and after school programs. And, the professional middle class wouldn't stand for it. And so, but it's seen as completely acceptable as long as these folks are using public resources to collect that data about them and rate their potential danger to their children and potentially open an investigation on their families based in part on that rating. And so there's this way that poor and working folks are often at the cutting edge of technological change, right? And in fact, one of the insights, one of the key sort of moments of this book comes from the earlier work. A woman I worked really closely with in Digital Dead End, Dorothy Allen is her pseudonym in the book. She said to me 20 years ago, like, oh, it's really important that you guys, meaning like middle class people, that you guys are doing this work, because after they're done with us, they're coming for you. Like, you should be paying attention. And that has always been in my head ever since, is like, if you want to look at the future of surveillance, if you want to look at the future of electronic governance, like, don't look at the things that are being designed for the professional middle class. Like, look at what's being designed for poor and working people. Because that's, I think often you could call it sort of a low rights environment.
For sure.
And even if people push back, they don't necessarily get traction because they also rely on these programs. And so
they lack the power to be able to have that.
They know perfectly well what's happening. Like, they're completely smart about it. But they are in relationships of structural violence that make it very difficult for them to make free and open choice, right? They're making structured choices. Right. So one of my frustrations with the way that particularly the privacy literature sometimes goes is the solutions that even very progressive, very interesting folks who are writing about data and privacy, they're often solutions that are not available to poor and working class people because we assume that the person trying to protect their privacy is a consumer of that technology, not a target of that technology.
Right. Well, read the manual, or confirm and consent, or even informed consent don't necessarily make sense in these contexts. Yeah, and I think when I think about it from the educational terms, I'm thinking about specifically here in Seattle, the access to technology is there, right? But the access to an after-school program that is going to allow you and teach you to do this, that, and the third with the technology, such as, for example, robotics, right? A robotics program may exist in this part of the city or this part of the city, but doesn't exist in this part of the city, right? Yeah. And so it really is, to me, it's also like, how is that structure provided? And it is like you're saying, the access is there, but this program is free, or this app is free, It's completely free. Don't worry about it. You don't have to pay a dime. But what do you need? Okay, I need you to log into your Facebook. I need you to give us your email address. I need us to give you your real, right. You're giving up something. Exactly. And so what does it mean not to have access to capital to be able to afford the paid service that lets you opt out of giving up all of that information?
And I think one of the sort of conceptual things I've been thinking a lot about is that we're so used to framing our civil and human rights conversations in terms of exclusion, like remedying exclusion, that it's often really hard for us to get our heads around, what do you do about oppressive inclusion, right? What do you do about people being involved in systems that then create increased vulnerability? Right. So the best, probably the most straightforward example would be like micro-targeting for credit now, right? Like, so underbanking is a huge issue, and not having access to good credit is a huge issue. And that's an exclusion issue, and it's really important. But at the same time, we also have to think about predatory credit. Right. The same goes for education. Of course, education is important, and of course, people shouldn't be excluded from education. Right. But there is now a whole industry of predatory education that includes people into systems that create debt and don't get them to the next place that they need to go. So we need to be thinking about, always need to keep your eye on exclusion. It's really important, and equal access. But we also need to keep our eye on this predatory inclusion. And I think many of these systems are systems of predatory inclusion.
Right. Yeah. Right. That's interesting.
And I'll say my colleague, Sita Penyan-Gangadaran, who I work with on this great project, which we'll talk about in a minute, called the Our Data Bodies Project, has written some really beautiful stuff about this. And I'm not going to be able to recall the name of the piece right off the top of my head. It's something in data and digital inclusion. I don't remember the something. Sorry, Sita. But I'll make sure to give you a link because it makes I've learned a lot of this from conversation with her. So
nice.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all this conversation made me think about when we did Latina Tech. So that was funded through the city of Seattle, through their technology match grant. And I applied for the grant, we got it. And I was designing a workshop for the women, but yet the ways in which they wanted me to track what was happening was based on, did they open an email account? What types of social services did they do? And I think it also, it doesn't allow for that agency of, do you need the technology in order to see your children, right? Because you haven't seen them for years and you're far apart. So it really limits and puts a box around what is appropriate and who gets to decide what is appropriate. And I think, tying it back to what you were saying, I wouldn't want anybody telling me what I can do with my technology or when I'm on my computer time. And so why is that okay when we create systems or we do things that are supposed to be helping people have access? Why do we have to target it and say, well, only this type of access is appropriate? And if you're not doing that, then you're missing the mark, right? And I think that's part of why we need to rethink what gets to count as being included and who gets to say what it is that they want for that.
For sure. And I always think about, is it better to be included and misrepresented or not included at all? Like sometimes I would just not rather be included at all.
Well, let me give you an example. So the example from the book, and by the way, I just remember Sita's, the name of her article, so I'm going to say it now. It's Data Profiling and Digital Inclusion, and it's in First Monday several years ago. It's a great piece.
Okay.
So the example would be the Los Angeles system, the coordinated entry system, right? So a really important system in many, many ways. They have, like I said, a catastrophic housing crisis in LA. And I don't actually blame any frontline homeless services worker who maybe wants to outsource making the decision of who among those 50,000 people get the limited resources they have.
Right.
I totally understand that. And also there were some real issues in the previous system that tended to value folks who were strongest and most compliant And often the most vulnerable people didn't get access to the resources they should have. And so I just want to be really clear that I think I understand a lot of why this stuff got built. That said, the VI SPDAT, if you'll remember, which is this survey, it includes questions like, do you ever trade sex for money? Are the police currently looking for you? Is there anyone, have you called a suicide hotline this month? How many times? This data goes into the HMIS, and 168 organizations can access it. And one of the organizations that can access it because it's in the Homeless Management Information System is the LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department.
Yeah.
And they can only access some of the information. They can't actually access people's answers to those questions. Those just go into the algorithm that create the vulnerability score. But they can access social security numbers and identifying information and names and last known address. And so there's a way in which I am concerned that this system could lead to the further criminalization of unhoused populations. So it actually serves people on either side of the vulnerability spectrum pretty well. Like very, very vulnerable people who really need to be in permanent supportive housing. As long as there's permanent supportive housing available, and that's another political issue, but I won't go into it. Like it actually serves them pretty well because they should be getting prioritized. I absolutely believe that. The other chunk of money that's available for homeless services in Los Angeles is a program called Rapid Rehousing. And rapid rehousing tends to be a shorter term, like 6 month to 2 year intervention, and not actually housing often, but like moving expenses, eviction, clearing up a possible eviction, like help identifying an apartment, stuff like that. And that's for folks who are fairly low vulnerability, who just became homeless and you're trying to keep them from ending up chronically homeless. But they've surveyed 39,000 people in Los Angeles County. They've managed to serve about 9,000 people on both ends of that. So with housing and also these smaller, more limited term interventions. And that leaves 30,000 people in this database who have gotten no services at all. But now this very personal, very identifiable information is being shared among 170 organizations, including the LAPD.
Wow.
And that's the kind of like oppressive inclusion that I'm talking about. It really can have a major impact on folks' life chances, right? On their material well-being and honestly on their life, whether or not they end up in prison, whether or not they end up getting housing, and whether or not they survive. So it's a really important form of oppression that we need to think about going forward.
For sure.
Well, and what comes to mind is how they internalize those messages, right? Because like, if you're collecting all this about me, then that's a trigger to say, well, the fact that I have called the suicide hotline, X number of times this month, wait, maybe there's something there, instead of I'm doing what I need to do to get the help that I need. What is the problem? Right.
Yeah. And that's, I can talk about that in the Pittsburgh case as well. But I want to say one of the things that's really extraordinary about being able to talk to folks who have been on the front lines of this, both from the caseworker side and from the unhoused side, is the unhoused are very strategic about how they use this. I'm not sure that homeless services folks know this, but the survey is available on the internet, and the unhoused have it. And they've been talking about like how to figure out, like, what do you admit that doesn't get you into legal trouble, but that will bump up your score, right? Like, people are smart, and there's, algorithms are inherently gameable. And so that's another choice, another political choice that's been made, is putting people in a position where they have to be very strategic about releasing their information, which may impact the quality of care they receive, right? Yeah. So, but I do want to say that, I haven't seen a lot of people internalizing the moral judgment of the VI SPDAT. I've rather seen kind of the opposite of people being like, wait, we can figure this out. And being very shrewd and very smart and very sort of proactive about sharing that information in the community. So yeah, it's been really fascinating. I've been in a very politically active unhoused community. So I worked both in Skid Row, which is in downtown Los Angeles, and also in South LA, which is has been rebranded, used to be known as South Central LA, but Watts and I'm forgetting the name of the other neighborhood now. Yeah, so the neighborhoods I've been working in tend to be very politically active. And so they're thinking in very strategic ways about how to make this work for their communities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So tell us about our data
bodies.
Yeah.
So, and then we have to get to the hope part before we close up. So I'll do 5 minutes on our data bodies and 5 minutes on hope. So the Our Data Bodies project, I'm super excited to be part of this project. It's a 3-year research project around the collection, use, sharing of information, of data, of digital information in marginalized communities across the United States. And we're working in collaboration with organizations in 3 cities. We're working in Los Angeles with an incredible activist and healing justice advocate named Mariela Saba, who is working out of Los Angeles Community Action Network and Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. And they're working in LA, mostly talking to people about housing, unhousedness or homelessness, and public housing. In Detroit, we're working with this extraordinary poet and organizer, particularly water justice organizer, named Tawana Petty. And she and the Detroit team, which includes the Detroit Community Technology Project, are working mostly around issues of utility shutoffs and evictions, but also some around the relationship between municipal open data and marginalized populations. And in Charlotte, North Carolina, we're working with the extraordinary Tamika Lewis, who is an organizer and an artist and an extraordinarily brilliant and generative person. And we're working in Charlotte around issues around reentry of folks leaving the criminal justice system and coming back to their home communities. And how their data profile sort of influences the kinds of decisions they can make moving forward. The last member of the team, besides myself, is Sita Pena Gangadaran, who I mentioned before. She's at the London School of Economics and has for a long time been really involved in policymaking around digital inclusion and data justice. So we're doing 150 interviews, 50 in each of those cities. We're doing a national survey of low-income households, and we're trying really hard to understand what people are really experiencing in their home communities. I'm really excited to be doing this work because it so nicely aligns with the work that I'm doing now. So the book that I just finished isn't an academic book. It's not based on academic research. It's purely investigative journalism. It's the first time I've done a book of investigative journalism, which is exciting and scary and great, and a whole nother conversation we can have in part 2.
Yeah.
Because it's been a really big change for me, a lot of big change. But one of the things that's nice about also being involved with Our Data Bodies is that we're going to have sort of the more complex, more rigorous data that we need to be making more generalizable claims about what we think is happening in these communities. So that's sort of the outcomes. We're hoping to write a great sort of report booklet, popular guide to data and discrimination. We're also hoping to produce a book of popular education exercises that organizations can use in their home communities to talk about the relationship between data and justice, data and surveillance, and how those are all related to class and race and sexuality and gender. And we also just really hope to build capacity in these incredible movements that are starting to think about this work, but maybe don't know what the next step is or don't have the support to take the next step.
Right. And I will just say that I got to meet all of them because they were at the Allied Media Conference, and I went to the session, and the tools that the way that the session was structured was extremely healing. And generative in so many ways, because I mean, it was basically founded on popular education principles, that, you know, sharing of the research, but really we started talking about, and I believe it was the woman from LA, Saba,
Maria, yeah.
She started with, tell me about your grandmother's grandmother. And so like we had table conversations about, you know, what do you know about your grandmother's grandmother and where she came from, right? And so, I mean, it really did start with the me and how this is connected. And there were spoken word poems that were created at the end of the session. I mean, it was just amazing, while also talking about the real issues. And so,
it's an extraordinary team of people. I feel so grateful to be part of it. I've learned so much from everybody on the team. And I think what you're reacting to is, there's all along, we've been very conscious to talk about, and I think this is a really big issue doing this kind of work around data in communities that have been under fire for a long time, is it's very easy for this work to become a reason for paranoia. And that is not a politically strategic place to start from, right? So our phrase is power, not paranoia.
I was going to say, that was the title.
How do we build power instead of inciting paranoia? And I think often with folks who are doing this work and have a really critical and smart take on surveillance, are not always taking that step of saying like, hey, I don't want to leave you feeling like you shouldn't access public resources, or you shouldn't leave your house, or, and in these communities, these are real decisions. Like, can you leave your house? Like, or is it too dangerous to do so? Like in terms of your relationship with the state, or is it safe to claim public benefits if that's going to affect the score you get in the Allegheny family screening tool? Like, should you get food stamps? It's like, well, yes, of course you should get food stamps, but here's what you can do to stay safe. Doing that. And so it always comes back to, how do we use this as a way to build power? And this is Domonique, I feel like you want to ask something, so I don't want to cut you off, but I'm all excited to talk about the hope part. So,
no, go for it.
Okay, so there's a good segue to the hope part, which is that I hope, and I believe on my good days, that these systems actually have so much reach, right? Like, not just in poor and working class people, but eventually they creep up, or eventually you as a professional middle class person fall down into the digital poorhouse, right? Like, we live at a time of extreme economic insecurity. And so more and more of us are going to come in contact with the system. And I hope, the pessimistic view is that then becomes so isolating that it demobilizes movements. The optimistic view is that we start to see our experiences reflected in each other in a way that is profoundly moving and allows us to create better alliance. And that's one of the reasons to keep talking about power, not paranoia, is because we want people to stand in the truth of their actual experience. And some of these experiences are incredibly traumatic and damaging, right? So the girl who I dedicate the book to, a young girl named Sophie Stipes in Indiana, I interviewed her family, and 5 days later she died. And one of the stories I tell is a story of a Black woman named Omega Young, who was kicked off her public assistance while she was in the hospital dying of ovarian cancer. Right. So these are real traumatic, intense experiences. And people will need to be supported to share the truth of those experiences. But my optimistic gut feeling is that actually a lot of us have these experiences. They may not be as intense as that, but I start the book with an anecdote about my own family, where just as I was starting to write the book, my partner was attacked and beaten very, very, very badly, almost to death, and recovered, thank goodness, and is doing much better and gets better all the time. But one of the hardest parts of that experience was that we had just switched to new health insurance just days before. And we were targeted for a healthcare fraud investigation because we put like $70,000 of claims in like 5 days after our insurance started. And I knew what was happening. I could tell what was happening because they were saying things like, oh, we're missing a start date in the system. And I was like, no, you're not, because we had insurance. We used it. So you had a start date. And they were like, I'm sorry, the system says you didn't have a start date. And I was like, no, I know what you're doing. You've launched a fraud investigation. And they're like, that's not what's happening. There's just a few missing digits. We must have accidentally deleted them. I was like, no, I know that's not what's happening. But of course, I could never get a clear answer from them, right? So these are the kinds of systems that other folks are facing. It's just that we only faced one of them at one time. Right. And we had incredible resources to support us. I had a ton of flexibility in my job. I could take it on like a full-time job, sort of beating back the insurance company.
Right.
We continued to get him medical care, even though we didn't know if we would have medical insurance, which is a choice that other people wouldn't be able to make. Mm-hmm. And we weren't already involved in Medicaid and food stamps and all these other programs that have similarly targeting and stigmatizing and punitive effects on people. Mm-hmm. But the optimistic story in this is, as this system grows, I hope that we can see our experiences mirrored in each other, and it will help us heal some of the divisions that have kept poor and working class people from organizing successfully in the past like 50 years. So when poor and working people organize together, they win, right? Like, this is the lesson of history from Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward and other people. But we have a lot of work to do in order to be a sort of a strong, resolute, and just movement of poor and working class people. So that's my hope. There's some great work going on in that right now. The Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign has been organizing for almost 20 years now, since '98. Mm-hmm. And they've been organizing to try to help people see themselves in the political category of poor. And to do that, they use the economic human rights from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So if you lack quality education, if you lack basic social services, if you lack housing, if you lack a job at a fair rate of pay that is safe for you, like if you lack any one of those things, you're poor. And that's really challenging. And they're doing it from an explicitly cross-race coalition place. But that's really challenging work. And they're also doing it in a way where it's led by the poor, which is also really challenging. But they've done really extraordinary work. They've been joined more recently by the New Poor People's Campaign, which is another coalition of folks who are working, I think, mostly out of the Midwest, but I'm not entirely sure. The Reverend Barber just joined as their executive director, one of the sort of key players in Moral Mondays. Mm-hmm. And all of them have been doing this really great sort of truth commission work about poverty in the United States, where people sort of are able to tell their stories. That said, I do think that movements are, they're thinking in really interesting and great ways around surveillance, particularly in historically surveilled communities. But I'm not sure that people are articulating what I call the digital poorhouse as that. Mm-hmm. And I hope that one of the things this book can do is broaden the conversation out a little bit. And specifically to broaden the conversation out from seeing surveillance as something that, surveillance and state violence, as something that only happens when there are police there, but that something that happens in all of these other systems, like the public assistance system and the homeless services system and the child, youth, and family services system, and that the state doesn't need a cop to kill you, right? That there are these kinds of very active and horrific violence that I think need to not be forgotten as we're having these incredibly important successes around challenging police brutality and police violence.
For sure.
So I hope that's some of the work that this book can do. It's an invitation to try to do that work. We'll see how well I wrote the invitation. But that is my hope, and that is what I thought I did. But we'll have to see what people think in January.
Nice. So that the book will be released January 2018?
That's right.
Nice.
Yeah. It is on pre-sale now.
All right. Awesome.
And I have actually turned it in, so it will exist.
Right. Yeah.
Little short period of time there where I was like, "Ooh, they're selling it." Like, I guess I really have to finish. So yeah, I'm really excited, and I'm currently on leave at my job, so to work on our Data Bodies project and also the book. So I'll have some time to do some traveling and come to places across the country and talk about the book, but also use the opportunity to help share some of the lessons of our data bodies and to help share some of the methods that we've used and to connect with movement folks and organizations.
So
it'd be really exciting work for me.
Are you planning on coming to Seattle?
Hey, invite me and I'll come.
All right.
Nice.
December?
Probably more like February to be safe.
Okay.
Make sure the book comes out first.
All right.
Yeah. February or March.
Very good.
Awesome.
All right. We can,
Awesome.
I will add that to my list of things to do.
For sure.
Because I don't know if you know this, but I'm quite patient. And
I have noticed that, yes. Ivette should get special props for chasing after me for like 8 months for us to do this. You were great and so patient, and I appreciate it.
Was it 8 months?
I don't know if it was that long, but it seems like it was a long time. My conception of time has changed quite a lot since finishing the book. I'm like, what do people do with all these hours of every day? Like, I'm not working 14 hours a day. This is great.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations again.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited about the book, and I hope people will be part of this conversation with me, because I think it's really important.
Awesome. And thank you so much for doing this with us. This is
I really appreciate the invitation. It's so great to talk to you. I feel like we could have gone for another hour.
I think we could have. And so basically, I'll do the wrap up here. Okay. My hope for this talk is that we get to share the information about your book, Domonique's work, really thinking about the intersections between social justice, education, and technology, and that we can't have one without thinking about the digital, because it is in every part of our lives, whether our personal, but also when we interact with the political system, when we interact with social services, in work now. I just had to upload two-factor authentication, and there were very limited options that I, it's like, so now I need the app, or I need to do this, otherwise I can't get paid through the University of Washington. So really thinking about when technology creeps in, who is it designed for? What is it intended for? And I think that we need to create more spaces to be able to have these conversations, because they're not neutral, right? Yeah. And so we'll put some resources together with this so that you can do more research on your own. And feel free to connect with FemTechNet, look up Ambassador Stories, check out Virginia's old books and the new book, Automating Inequality. And thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. This was really fun.
Generation of impatience, with the definition of our hatred, with the mimic hypocritics, and you've seen it all. Only in it for an instant, so we never call. My mama hasn't heard my voice, it's been days. Raise our minimum wage, so we never stray too far. Embrace the fake, so we never change, never grow to know who we really are. Out come the wolves, Wall Street, count sheep, sleep good. California kings, Hollywood's Robin Hoods. We can understand what we never understood. You wanna change the world? Well, we could. You wanna change the world? Well, we could. Here we go. You wanna change the world? Well, we